Magi: The Adventures of Sinbad. This is definitely a read that subverted my expectations, and I never knew I wanted this out of Magi. When I first came into Magi: The Adventures of Sinbad, I thought we were gonna get more adventure, just like how we did in Magi. To put it in simplistic terms, I just thought it was gonna be more Magi, but with Sinbad. But it turns out this manga is a lot more than that. If I had to describe it, Magi as a whole would be the cookies, while The Adventure of Sinbad would be the milk. Milk is alright by itself, and cookies are great, but once you dip the cookies in that milk, oh my god! I'm sorry, I'm a fat fuck. But rather than just being a simple, more Magi type of story, we get a real taste of Magi's world building, and how the politics actually take a focus in this same world. Seeing Sinbad start from the bottom and learn how to run a kingdom, conduct business, and silver tongue his way through negotiations. But not only this, seeing Sinbad build a Seven Seas alliance is just so satisfying. Not only do we get to see more of Magi's world, with all of these brand new locations that we've only gotten hints of in the original Magi, but we get to dive into the lifestyles and cultures of every single one of these new locations. It's like your initial idea of Sinbad gets blown out of the water because there's so much more to him that you wouldn't initially understand. So much more to the countries that work alongside him as well. As great as a man as Sinbad may seem on the surface, even he has skeletons inside of his closet. And in this manga, you definitely get to see those skeletons. Some of them might even catch you off guard. And in terms of the Magi universe, this manga gives us one of the best villains in the series, and my personal favorite, Barbosa. Seeing the relationship between him and Sinbad will have you on edge, because Barbosa is practically Sinbad's equal. He even enables Sinbad to do most of the things he does in the series. In fact, he is a reason as to why Sindria exists in the first place. And seeing Sinbad and Barbosa's dynamic hits very different. It's truly something you never really knew you wanted out of Magi. In fact, you would never really think anything like this would have came out of this series. Both Sinbad and Barbosa have a relationship where they both use each other. But despite this interest, there's also turmoil between the two because the way they view the world and how a kingdom should be ran is completely different. But despite it all, they both develop a mutual respect for one another and eventually develop a friendship. In this manga, Sinbad gets done dirty and dragged so much, and this rivalry is just a taste of that. Seeing Sinbad get cornered with words and ultimately playing 4D chess just to get out of these situations is what makes this different from the original Magi. Seeing Sinbad make these crazy sacrifices for his greater plan, decisions that as you read it'll completely make your jaw drop, will have you torn emotionally just like Sinbad. Despite Barbosa and how terrible of a guy he is, even in times when he does use Sinbad, they take this villain, and you know he has bad intentions, but you can't help but to like him. It makes you feel confused just as Sinbad is while he's thrown into these situations. I know this guy is a horrible human being, but he's making my dream become a reality. This is just one of the mental turmoils Sinbad is thrown into. And one of the big ones, and probably the best part of this manga, is when we see Sinbad become a slave. As a slave, he has to do things that he does not want to do, a lot of tasteless things. But there comes a point in the story where he's no longer a slave, but despite having this newfound freedom, he's never actually free. Because ultimately, Sinbad is a slave to his own ideals. And this really is some god tier writing. Especially if the world building or political aspects aren't really enough to warrant your read through. But even then, just getting more story based on a character as amazing as Sinbad alone should warrant a read through. And in comparison to the original Magi, some people after reading this even like Sinbad more than the original Magi. And that's mainly because of the different writing style used in this manga in particular. But I will say, for me personally, Sinbad did have its epic adventure moments, but despite that, I couldn't help but feel as if at times it could be pretty boring. You might not have that issue, but in comparison to the original Magi, that is kind of my big issue on that. Because obviously the political talk isn't something that everyone's going to find enjoyable, so I can't really say this manga is for everyone. But if you're a Magi fan and you can appreciate those kind of details and interesting dialogue that we get mere tastes of in the original Magi, then this is definitely for you. Another issue with the Adventures of Sinbad, at times I felt like the art was definitely just not holding up to Otaka. But obviously, you shouldn't expect it to, but regardless, it's still good nonetheless. I just felt like at times if Otaka would have drawn certain moments at Sinbad, they would have been a lot better. It's kind of like with Toyotaro and Toriyama. If Toriyama would have drawn something that Toyotaro drew, it would have most likely been better. So if you like just how powerful Otaka can make her emotional scenes have, or essentially the kind of weight that she adds to her manga, it's here, but it's just not done as well. It's just so crazy how despite being a story about Sinbad, this manga is more than just that. After rereading Magi, after looking at this manga, the very moment Sinbad is introduced and we get to see the Seven Seas Alliance, it really does hit different. And in comparison to the original Magi, this is actually a lot darker, because there will be character deaths. And obviously seeing Sinbad get dragged through the mud isn't the prettiest thing to watch either. But I cannot stress it enough, these things right here warrant a read-through. There are a lot of other things I do want to mention in this review, but unfortunately I can't because I want to save the spoilers for you. So really it's best if you just go read it. It's not even that long either. It is literally half the length of the original Magi. As much as you might have grown to love characters like Alibaba, Aladdin, and Morgiana, you will not regret seeing the adventures of Sinbad, Jafar, and the rest of the Seven Seas Alliance. Some of the best moments in this manga aren't even from Sinbad. Seeing Drakon originally start off as a human and then assimilates with his household vessel, turning him into a monster. And the turmoil he goes through really builds on his character from the original Magi. And speaking of characters, this manga actually has a bunch of new ones outside of Barbosa, like Lady Saradine. And her debate with Sinbad is another one of my favorite moments in this manga, and that scene in itself just goes to show what type of energy this manga is on. Despite how talented Sinbad may be, or how good his skills are, those things mean nothing when it comes to actually being a king, or running a kingdom. You can have these grand dreams and you can be as naive as you want. But at the end of the day, no matter how much skill or talent you might have, that is not going to get your kingdom off the ground. And you can't expect to do all these things without getting your hands dirty. If you really want something, you're always going to have to make sacrifices. And I feel like that is truly what this manga is about. If I had to give this manga a score, I would probably give it an 8 out of 10, but I would still recommend you go out and read it, especially if you're a fan of Magi. If you would like more Magi content, please let me know in the comment section below, and I will see you guys in the next video.